Watch out! It's an orc. A disgusting monster who enjoys nothing more than killing. Oh wait, no. It's the violent yet noble kind who will fight for honor. Oh, no. It's an unwilling conscript sent to war by the Dark Lord. Why do they all look so different though? Through times, orcs have been depicted in many different ways. And depending on when you grew up, you might picture a very different creature than someone older or younger than yourself. And I'm not even talking about aesthetics here, though some of you are probably picturing the green orcs from Warhammer and Warcraft. And others might imagine the grey, black, brown or even blue variants from Lord of the Rings or Dungeons and Dragons. But actually, I don't want to ask about looks. I want to ask a much more philosophical question today. Are orcs people or monsters? Let's start with the orcs I grew up with. In a long distant past, historians nowadays only refer to as the early 2000s. Back then, the world was a place almost unrecognizable from today's view. Smartphones were a novelty that didn't dominate our lives yet, and a terrorist attack shook not only America but the whole world. And as a direct consequence, we now have penis detection machines at every airport and can't take drinks on a flight anymore. But I digress, because, more importantly, it was also a time that shaped people's views on orcs on a huge scale. It was 2001, right around Christmas, when a fantasy epic shook the cinematic world. The Lord of the Rings, the Fellowship of the Ring, hit the cinemas, and it hit hard. In this fantasy epic, we saw the depiction of orcs that fantasy nerds of old already knew from the books. Sadistic, filthy creatures modeled after Harvey Weinstein. The resemblance is almost uncanny. They love nothing more than inflicting pain and the taste of human flesh, while the Dark Lord commands them from the depths of Mordor. And if you see another resemblance of Harvey Weinstein in that is coincidental. But enough about those orcs or the ring that is somewhere in that story. Instead, let's talk about another big hit in this era of yore. Something that won the world by storm in the summer of 2002. This time, it wasn't the cinematic world that was shaken to its core, but rather the world of video games. Warcraft 3 showed a different kind of orcs. Violent creatures, sure, but they were honorable at heart and willing to fight for the good cause, if only nudged in the right direction by a prophet. And they didn't look like monsters either, they looked more like buff green people. A trend that continued with World of Warcraft, the game that I spent more of my teenage years with than I would ever be willing to admit. This depiction of orcs changed everything. Most orcs portrayed before that time were much more like Tolkien's ones. Ugly, bad-tempered, animalistic humanoids. So animalistic that in some of the old artworks, orcs even had boar or pig heads. Like in this depiction from the very first edition of D&D. Just look at those glorious swine things. They kinda look like these porcine monsters from the Zelda series. I wonder if that's related somehow. Gary Gygax had a pretty clear vision with those orcs. They are evil creatures your players can slaughter without feeling bad about it. The only good orc is a dead orc. And since all orcs are evil, it would also not break a lawful paladin's alignment to slaughter orc women and children. In fact, Gygax called this a lawful action and fun for the whole family. And while the aesthetics of Tolkien's and D&D's orcs would dominate how people pictured orcs for decades to come, there was one that was wildly different. I have to admit that I fell into a bit of a Warhammer 40k rabbit hole when I started reading about these, but my research paid off immensely, for I have found out everything there is to know about greenskins. My conclusion goes as follows. Green is best. Orcs are green, therefore orcs are best. But don't let their appearance fool you, for these are the most bloodthirsty type of orc you'll ever lay your eyes upon. The sci-fi version especially was actually bioengineered as a weapon on galactic scale. They destroy and infect planets, returning again and again, ready to slaughter everything in their path. And since we've already talked about Warcraft, in the first game of the series, as well as in the second part, we see orcs basically the same as in Warhammer. Green beasts who invade this world to wage war against the humans. Though, In those games you can at least play as the orcs and wage war on Azeroth. Or if you were too young back then, you could at least watch your older brother play sometimes. Definitely not speaking from experience here. Anyway, how'd we get from all of those monstrous creatures to, well, people? I distinguish two specific turning points in history, and both times we gotta go back to where this whole story started, to Lord of the Rings. First, we look at the movies that you are probably familiar with, the Peter Jackson ones. So, let's look at this specific scene that we all know and love.
Looks like meat's back on the menu, boys!
You heard it, meat's back on the menu. And if there's an orc menu, that means there are also orc restaurants. And you know what that means? Orc culture. And for the second one, we gotta take a look at the movies yet again. But not the modern ones. We are looking at the timeless classic from 1980, of course. The Return of the King, an animated Lord of the Rings movie. And what really stands out in this one is the great singing voice orcs seem to possess. I mean, listen to this, it's a real banger.
We don't wanna go to war today, but the Lord of the Lashes says nay, nay, nay.
Orcs are shown as unwilling conscripts in a war who'd much rather do different things in life. Probably singing. It's really heartbreaking and a sign for what is to come. With the Warcraft franchise rising in popularity, we became witness to a new era of orcs. Suddenly, making orcs a noble warrior species became the thing for orcs. And even if Blizzard didn't invent it, their games sure as hell made it popular. Gone were the times of orcs being brown, black or grey. Henceforth, orcs would be green. Gone were the times of bloodthirsty evil creatures. From now on, orcs would be a violent but honorable people. From now on, orcs would be green Glingans. And of course, modern orcs are not just of good character, they are also hot. Like, all of the women have armor that barely even covers their body, and of course they always get those extremely huge weapons. The male orcs, on the other hand, they also often have a, let's call it, certain aesthetic. Though the buff muscular orc depiction is a bit older actually. Just look at those thighs. Wait, is this still realm of fantasy, or are we slowly drifting into barely disguised fetish territory? Anyway, luckily it is not an ongoing trend to make monsters hot. I mean, can you imagine? That would be really weird. Of course, evil orcs still exist in modern time as well. Warhammer ones being the most famous ones, I guess. They be green, they be mean, they go Wah! That wasn't good for my vocal cords. And I don't really know why I always come back to Warhammer. I'm not even into that franchise. So, let's get into something I'm actually into. Let's dive into the world of role-playing games. But first, I'd like to hear which kind of orcs you prefer. Let me know in the comments. We have already taken a look at the orcs of old in the world of D&D, and for a long time there was no significant change. Orcs were some kind of warmongering savages, and if you wanted to play one, well, you were supposed to go for a half-orc, if you want to go for it at all. And adding playable orcs was an afterthought. Some editions even cautioned you to stay away from playing monstrous races, unless you want to go for an evil campaign. You monster! That sentiment has changed though. And I think not just in the latest 2024 edition of D&D, but in 5e in general. Volo's Guide to Monsters officially added orcs as a playable species for player characters, probably because that's what players wanted. And if people want to play orcs, they obviously should be able to. You can already play elves, dwarves, tieflings and a plethora of other weird characters in the world of D&D, so why not orcs? I mean, shouldn't it be on the players around the table who decide which species in your world are inherently evil and which ones aren't? You don't really need a corporation to tell you what to do you? And, oh boy, I almost forgot about that. There's a whole debate going on if we should really call orcs a species. Some people claim that this is woke and that the world is about to end because of it. It's a slippery slope after all, and next thing they're gonna remove orcs from the monster manual or something. Wait, orcs actually have been removed from the monster manual? Or have they? Not really. The new monster manual doesn't include an orc or a drow stat block, but it includes generic humanoid ones like warrior, assassin or cultist. And you can flavor those as orcs, drow, or whatever the hell you want. Which, in my opinion, is a much better approach anyway. I'm starting to think that people who throw around the word rogue as criticism do so without critically thinking. But who am I to say? What I am really interested in today though is not how to use orcs as player characters, but rather how to use orcs as enemies, or if we should do that to begin with. I'm not going to argue whether it is morally acceptable to have a species of evil beings to kill, because to me there's a much better argument to avoid using orcs in that way. And that argument is that purely evil monsters are extremely boring. And that goes for everything that's just in there for your players to kill. At the very least, there should always be a way to negotiate or to talk your way out of an encounter. And in general, I'd even say, replacing a monster with humans is almost always a good idea. And the same goes for replacing boring evil orcs with at least somewhat more sophisticated ones. They can even be green if that's your jam. And all of that doesn't even stop you from using them as dungeon denizens or as a subterranean species. You can even keep their violent ways. Maybe they have a culture where personal strength plays a much higher role, where keeping faith is extremely important, and where declining a duel of a worthy opponent is simply not an option. Maybe they only pretend to be cruel because they know exactly that the gods would destroy the world and only their sacrifice of bloody wars is keeping them at bay. Unless they are in their own huts, where they can be the loving family they so deeply want to, if only there weren't those bloody gods. Or whatever other weird reason you want to give them to be violent. One of the fun aspects of D&D and other role-playing games are interesting moral choices. And while that might not be the only thing that makes those games fun, at least for me it still plays a part. And if orcs in your game are just evil monsters your players can kill without a second thought, and even their children are just there for the slaughter, where's the interesting choice in that? And even if you say moral choices are nothing you really care about, TTRPGs are still games about making interesting choices. And with evil orcs you don't really have to choose, you just slaughter them. I think it's a good thing we started personifying and humanizing orcs in fiction, video games and of course role-playing games. They make for more interesting characters, more interesting enemies and more interesting allies. They can enrich your world building and of course they are fun. One-dimensional characters aren't fun in any kind of fiction. And if you now say, but Lord of the Rings is good fiction and it's got pretty one-dimensional orcs. And yeah, you're right, but Lord of the Rings is not a story about orcs or about war. It's a story about the ability of all of us, even the smallest ones, to save the world. It's also about friendship and about adventure and about taking strolls in the countryside, but whatever. So, to answer the question from the very beginning of this video, are orcs monsters or people? I have to say, they can be either. But if you want interesting orcs, they should be people. Let me know your thoughts in the comments though. And with all that said, let's give it back to the singing orcs from the 1980s! Where there's a web, there's a way. A crack on the back says we're gonna subscribe. We're gonna like this video and more. Where there's a web, there's a way.